I'm going to be talking today about segmented wood turning, and I understand there are a lot of very talented wood turners in your group. Before I begin my PowerPoint, let me just begin by showing you some of the pieces that I will be doing. If you all can see this. Okay, this is one of the pieces I will be showing step by step how I produced it. Segmented wood turning is of course made up of a lot of individual pieces of wood glued together and then turned.
Gene, can you spotlight him so it blows it up, please?
I'm sorry?
I'm trying to get Gene to spotlight you so it blows it up to the full screen.
Oh, okay.
I already did, so you have to go to full screen on your end.
Full screen.
Yeah, no, Don, you're fine. The person asking, there's a full screen mode on your Zoom application, but I've already pinned Don's session, so you have to full screen on your end.
It's called speaker view. Speaker
Correct.
view on the upper right-hand part of your screen.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, let me, here we go. Okay, so this piece I will be demonstrating, and you can see it's made up of a number of different rings. And for example, here is here's a ring before I have assembled it, and they would be going something like this. And you just stack the rings up, glue them together, and make an object like this. And the rings in turn are made of segments like these, and the segments are put together to make the individual. So this is one piece that I'll have in my PowerPoint in just a moment. Just a couple of other examples of pieces that I've done. I didn't begin turning, when I retired 10 years ago, I bought my lathe and turned our garage into a workshop. And I've only been turning now for about 9 or 10 years. Here is another piece that I turned, segmented wood turning, combining a couple of different kinds of wood, cherry, maple, and this is ebony here at the top. And then I added a ring of jewels, beads around that I borrowed from my wife here. So that's one. Here is another example. This is kind of a southwestern motif, a bowl, and you can see the whole nature of the bowl, the different possibilities for the feature ring here. Here's one. This is a cremation urn. I've made a number of these. This is one of the Chinese symbol Shu, which stands for longevity or long life, which I thought was appropriate for a cremation urn. And then here on the lid is the yin and yang with a gold leaf, kind of featuring the yin and yang of longevity, if you will. And let's see, here's one I made recently. It's kind of a variation on segmented turning. This is more staves, but each individual one held together. And then this is one of my favorite pieces here. This I call the graduate. And I don't know how many hundred pieces it is, but just there you can see inside of it. This is made from maple and sapelli. And then lastly, in addition to this piece that I'll be showing you in the PowerPoint, how I put it together, I'll be showing you this piece. Oops. Yeah, this is one of the largest pieces I've turned. This is a Greek key piece, and I'll be showing you at the planning stage for this, how I went about planning the various parts of it, the size, the design for it, and so on, and then how I got it all assembled here. All right, well, let's go ahead now. Let me pull up PowerPoint. Now, I've shown this PowerPoint to the Woodpeckers Guild, so George and Dave have already seen most of this, although this is a bit updated now. Here are some examples of segmented wood turnings. Since I only began doing wood turning about 10 years ago, but I've been doing art almost all of my life. My background is biology and neurobiology, so for years I've been getting out and drawing pictures of flowers and paintings of neurons and so on. Over the years, I've taken some courses, Baltimore County continuing ed courses, and learned how to make a coffee table. And here's a toy chest for our grandson. And then later, I have made some clocks, Frank Lloyd Wright style clocks, combining both wood and glass together. Then I took some courses in stained glass, and I think this kind of was a stepping stone or set the seed for my segmented turning, because there are a lot of similarities between segmented wood turning and doing stained glass, where you're cutting small pieces very precisely and putting them together. This is more like two-dimensional wood turning here for these paintings. But then finally, this lampshade over our dining room table, this is about as close as you can get to segmented wood turning. This is like segmented glass turning. And this is a lot of the same principles involved here. Okay. Let me begin with just a summary of segmented wood turning. For those who are not familiar with it, pay close attention here. Okay, any questions? All right, well, let me then go ahead and we'll save time for questions at the end. Segmented wood turning, how does it compare to just regular turning? Well, turning a log, what you do, you take the log, you put it on the lathe, kind of picture what you want to get out of that log, a bowl or a vase or a platter. And then you just turn on the lathe and remove everything that doesn't look like a bowl, and you end up with a bowl. And what you end up with depends a lot on what's hidden inside the log, the grain and so on. So you're dependent on what's in the wood, and you're limited in what you can make in that regard. Well, with segmented wood turning, it's a lot more like building furniture, I found. It allows for greater creativity. You get to use up, I don't know if you're like me, but I have a bin full of small pieces of scrap wood that I don't want to throw away or burn. And it's a great opportunity to use those. A lot less waste. When you turn a log into a bowl, you're removing 90% of it and ending up using that as mulch. But here there's much less waste because you're just taking slices of wood from a board. You can combine multiple species for accent, species of wood. Because of the way you orient the segments, there's no end grain turning, and end grain is always a little bit difficult getting it smooth and taking the finishes and so on. And you can make a lot of different forms, as we'll see as we go through this. So, okay. Oh, okay. Before we go any further, my legal counsel has advised me to issue the following disclaimer. According to him, I'm living proof that this is the case. However, I'll assume there are exceptions in the audience right now, but I am living proof that this is the case. Okay, well, what tools are required? Well, just briefly, you need something to cut strips of wood, so a table saw, miter saw, bandsaw. I typically use my table saw for this. You need an accurate protractor or miter gauge, a sander. I use a disc sander with a jig, just a minor amount of sanding involved. Glue, lots of glue. You might want to buy stock in the glue company. I use Tight Bond glue. A lot of glue, and of course a lathe. So if you have all these tools, you're all set to go. You can begin this afternoon. Okay, basic components. Here we have the basic ring components, a stack of rings that go into making the thing. The rings are built from segments, and each segment is a trapezoid-shaped piece of wood, and particular thickness or height, if you will, particular length, which is the part exposed on the outside, and the width refers to the depth of the piece depending on the design of the piece that it's going into. And then the miter angle. The miter angle depends on a lot of features that we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, now there is software out there to help you design and plan your bowl or object. SketchUp is one that works. I've done software development during my life, and even though I like software, I prefer the old-fashioned plan. You can draw your layout on graph paper, which is what I'll show you in a minute that I typically do. But you just need to lay out a profile cross-section of your piece of work that you're going to assemble, and then figure with the wood that you have available what thickness and width and length and so on you need for assembling the various rings. Okay, now we're going to focus on this for the next few minutes. Here's on graph paper, the Greek key urn that I showed you just a few minutes ago, about 18 inches tall. And here's on a piece of graph paper, after making a number of sketches, you come up with a final sketch outline of the object you want to put together. So you draw the outline on graph paper. Call me old-fashioned. This is what I prefer to do. Then you need to plan the number of rings, the thickness of the rings, the species of the rings that you're going to be assembling. How many rings? Well, this will depend in part on how tall you want the object to be, the lumber that you have available, how thick it is, if it's 5/4 or if it's an inch or 7/8 of an inch. That will determine how many rings you need. On the piece that I showed you here, it's made up of 19 rings, and I label them alphabetically because there's so many other numbers. Alphabetically A, B, C, D, if you go up to S. So this is how many rings there would be. And then you need to determine the maximum diameter of each ring. So just for example, just picking ring G here. On graph paper, if you've designed it appropriately, you can just measure the number of squares across, and you would know that the maximum diameter here is 9.25 inches for ring G. Okay, well, of course, it's going to be greater diameter at the top than at the bottom of the ring because of the angle right here. Up here, where it's vertical, it would be the same. Here, it's very different. So you have to determine the maximum diameter and then add a bit for waste because you're going to be peeling it off. You need to kind of plan for how thick you expect the wall to be. Is it going to be 3/8 of an inch, or 1/4 inch, or 1/2 inch, or whatever, depending on the size? So first of all, you determine the diameter for each ring, and I put that information in this column, diameter. Okay, then you want to calculate the circumference. How much wood will be going all the way around in the circle? Well, that's easy to do. You just take the diameter and multiply by pi to give you the circumference, and I put that in the second column here. So the circumference, 29 inches. Okay, so that means that when you cut the strip of wood for ring G, you're going to have to allow for 29 inches plus a few additional inches for waste. Okay, then how many segments do you want in each ring? Well, every turner has their preference. I prefer 16 segments per ring. This is what I typically work with. So all of these rings here from C on up here have 16 segments per ring. Down here at the bottom, where it's the base, the first two rings will not be hollowed. So I just have 4 segments, like 1/4 of a pie, 4 segments. Up here in the neck region where it's real narrow, I use just 8 segments in each of these 4 rings. But all of the rest had 16. So 16 segments per ring. So you need to calculate now the length of each segment. And that's simple. It's just the circumference divided by the number of segments. So 29-inch circumference on this one. The length would be 29 divided by 16, 1.8 and change. Then you need to know the miter angle. Well, the miter angle kind of goes with the number of segments. The miter angle would be 360 degrees divided by the number of segments, and that divided by 2, because each segment is mitered on both sides. So for 16 segments, the miter angle would be 11.25 degrees. Okay, and then finally we need to know the width, if you will, of each segment. And that's going to depend on where it falls in the overall design. So like here, these rings are on the vertical part of the vase, and as a vertical, the width does not need to be very large. So 1 inch is the width. Down here, where we've got a bit of a taper, we have to add more, so 1.5 inches for these guys. Right here, the shoulder, where it dives in, the width would be, I think, 3.5 inches. So the width depends on where it is in the overall design and the angle that it's going to be subjected to. Then if you're going to include a feature ring, you have to lay out all the details for that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. If you don't want to do the calculations for length, there are tables available like this one for segment length, where you just go down how many segments. Well, here's 16 segments, and the diameter over here, 9.25 inches we just looked at. So the length would be 1.8, which is what we had calculated ourselves. So either way. Okay, now to get to some actual cutting here, what we need to do is to cut strips, and I used my table saw. And the length of the strip, the width of the strip is determined by the calculations that we made back here. Here we're going to be looking at this first bowl that I showed you, this guy right here. And we're going to see how this is assembled. So these are the pieces that I cut from this maple and bloodwood putting together. The dimensions depend on what we've calculated before. So we're going to cut the pieces and then put them all into a bowl for each ring. Cutting, here it is on the table saw, miter gauge. I have it set for 11.25 degrees. Miter gauge laid out there. I have my fence set for the appropriate thickness and the correct angle and length for each segment. Now I can see some warning signals going off. I do not leave my fence here when I'm actually cutting this. I just have it for demonstration. I would normally move the fence back and have a block right here to do the actual measurement. So don't worry about that. But this was how I would cut the individual trapezoid pieces. And there are two different ways of doing this. One is you can just take the piece and cut it like this. So you have strip piece 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then you have a lot of waste. Now you would use this only if you have wood that has a particular grain in it that you want to show on the outside of the bowl. Okay, that's very unusual. Usually the grain looks pretty much the same on this side or the other side of a piece. So what I do typically is to just flip the strip over between each cut. So you can just 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I would take the strip after I cut it, I would just take the strip, flip it over, and then cut the next one. And keep going until I've cut 16 or 17 to be on the safe side. Okay, now we begin with the base. Well, For the base, what I do, I take a face plate, attach a waste block, just from a 2x4, I think, a waste block, and then I glue the base onto, here I've glued the base onto the waste block. Now the base, there's several different approaches. You can do a solid piece, and this is a solid piece that I made here because it's a small bowl. More typically, you do a segmented bottom piece. I usually do 4 pieces glued together. But then there are other ways of doing it, a tapered plug and floating discs, which I've done on a number of occasions. But typically I'll do a segmented base piece. Okay, now once I have cut, for example, these pieces were cut from a strip about this size. I have 16 pieces. I usually take them over then to my disc sander and just very gently sand the 2 faces, the mitered faces that I've cut. They're pretty smooth to begin with, but I'll just sand them a little bit. And I've made a jig here with the particular angle where I can just take this piece, push it in there, and just tap it to the rotating sandpaper, and it will just give a very smooth surface. Now there's always a little bit of fuzz left over after cutting and sanding, so I usually just take a block of sandpaper on my bench and get rid of those before trying to glue. Then I measure the length, make sure that we're not under the length we want. We want to be very much in the ballpark. A little bit over is okay, but we definitely don't want to be under. So this would be 1.12 inches. And if 1.1 is my goal, we're good. Okay, so now if we take the 16 pieces, no matter how careful we've been, no matter how accurate our miter gauge is, if I put them all together just dry into a pipe clamp and hold it up, we're going to get tight junctions at most of the pieces, but then there are going to be gaps. Now we can't proceed with gluing if we have a gap like this. So what are some options? Well, when I first started out 10 years ago, I would hold this up, take a pencil, and just make a little mark right here and here and here, indicating that I needed to take a little bit off and go over to sandpaper and sand it down and then put it back in and do this 4 or 5 times until I got no light coming through. And then I would glue the pieces all at once. I've learned in the meantime that there are more efficient ways of doing it. And one way is to simply do it in halves. You take 8 of your pieces, glue them together, take 8 more, this is more than 8, take half of your pieces, glue them together, the other half, glue them together, and then leave a little wedge between the 2 halves, clamp them together, let the glue dry, and then simply take the 2 dried pieces over to sandpaper and sand them on a flat surface, and then glue the final 2 halves together. That works beautifully. You have to be really close. You can't have a major angle error in here, or it'll really show up in the final product, but this works. The way, however, that I do it is simply by gluing 2 at a time. Here are 16 pieces. I've glued 2 individual pieces together and let them dry. So now we have essentially 8 pieces. So I would take each of these each piece one at a time, take it over, put in the jig made for 8 pieces rather than 16, put it in, just remove a little bit of the squeeze out glue from the top and bottom, angle it. It would be 22.5 degrees rather than 11.25. Put glue on, make quarters, 4 quarters. Let that dry, do the same thing, get 2 halves, put that on the sander, and we get our final product. Okay, so we have now, with all that we've done, we have 1 ring. Okay. Remember the Greek vase had 19 rings. Okay, so now we have our first ring, ring 1. Okay, now this ring, you can see no matter how carefully we've put this together, the pieces are not all going to be, the surface is not going to be perfectly flat. There's squeeze out of glue, little irregularities here. So what I do, I take each ring, mount it onto an MDF board on my lathe. I mount it on with just 4 drops of CA glue. So at 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock, I'll put a drop of CA glue, spray accelerant, put it on, and then flatten this surface. Now I'll flatten it with a scraper or ball gouge. And what we need to do is to get the surface perfectly flat so we can glue it on. Now it has to be flat not only from here to here, but also flat from here all the way over to there. And to determine that, what I do is take a straight edge, put it across both sides, then put a flashlight underneath. And as we see here, the straight edge is in contact with the inner corner here, but there's light coming through out here. So this tells us I need to take off a little bit on the inside face. So I go in, take off a little bit more, do it again. When I get pretty close, I then just take a board with a piece of sandpaper, turn the lathe on, and flatten the surface to final dimensions. Okay, so now once we have that final flat face, this figure here shows gluing it to the base. So I had taken the base, this is the waste block, the base, I had flattened the base with a sandpaper. We have a flat base. I take this first ring, flip it over because this face now is flat. The other face that's glued to the MDF is still rough. So I put the flat face on, glue it to the base. I made this jig early on to do the gluing. I don't really use this much anymore. I find that a brick, just putting a brick here on the surface does the same thing. You don't need that much pressure. So here we are after we put that, this was the first ring we just looked at. Here's the next ring I put on. Here is the accent ring that we have on the middle, and I'll talk about the veneer. But what we're doing is just at each point flattening the face like this, gluing, flattening, gluing, flattening, gluing. This is what segmented turning is about. 90% of the time, you're just assembling pieces like this. So here we can see the 4 CA glue spots that I had this piece glued to the MDF. When I pop it off, a little of the MDF comes off with it. What I would be doing next is flattening the surface of this piece, just like we did before we glue on the next piece. Now, at this point, when we're halfway through, I would probably begin smoothing out the outer and the inner surfaces because they're readily accessible. We've got a wide opening. We don't have a narrow neck that we have to work through. So this would be a good time to begin flattening things out. And here you can see we've gone forward a little bit. Here's the piece I have flattened out the surface. We've added 2 more rings to what we have here. We've added this ring and this ring, and we've smoothed them out on the outside and the inside. And now we're ready to glue on the neck, which is the narrow region. And I just placed this block on, ready to glue. And then we're going to put a layer of veneer on, and then the final top piece we will glue on, and I'll glue those together, put them back on the lathe, and then this is what the product looks like after turning the neck region. So here you can see the outside of the bowl is pretty much finished. Here it is before I have put any finish per se on it. Here, while it's still on the lathe, I usually put my first coat of finish. Now, what finish do I use? Well, everybody has their own preference. I've always preferred tung oil varnish for the pieces that I do. So I'll put the first layer of tung oil varnish, and I use Formby's tung oil varnish is my favorite. I'll put the first coat on, let it sit for a day, and then sand it lightly, put a second coat on, and then I just do 1 additional coat, maybe up to half a dozen or more over the course of a week. Now, to remove this from the waste block, I mean, this is the waste block. What I would do is just go in with a parting tool and just cut in here till it's still attached by maybe 1/4 of an inch of wood. Then I would turn off the lathe, get a coping saw or a Japanese saw, and just saw that off, and then use a fine chisel and file to finish off the bottom piece. Okay, so this is the piece that I was showing you earlier before we started the PowerPoint. Very simple, basic turning. Now, at this point, I just want to talk about embellishments, feature rings that often add accent to the piece. Here is a Grecian urn, if you will, that I made with essentially no embellishments. It's just all the simple piece designed after a Grecian urn. I did put a little shoulder piece on here, but if I simply took this piece and laid it down, it would be lying on its side and rolling around like real Grecian urns did, many of them. A lot of Grecian urns have been discovered on the bottom of the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea from boats that sank. So I just wanted to make a holder here, so I turned a piece of dark wood, carved out some waves, if you will, and made this as a base to hold the piece. So that's one way to do an embellishment, make it separate. The simple band that I made here, very simple embellishment. The darker wood, and then 2 layers of veneer that you saw me put on earlier. Just a layer of maple veneer and a darker ebony type veneer. I glued them together, put them on just as a very subtle accent piece. And then I also sawed off the four corners the round mouth here to make a little accent out here at the opening. Okay, another way a feature ring is the Greek key. Here's the piece that I showed you earlier, the Greek key, amphora. Here's another piece that's on the rack behind me in my room. Here's one that Ron Ford in the Baltimore area Turners. Here's one that he made with the Greek key kind of facing it in the other angle. Essentially, I had to make 16 segments, each segment being a Greek key. And this was a good deal of work. Let me just show you briefly how I did it. Here's out of a book showing how a variation of a Greek key can be made, putting it together piece by piece. What I did was, again, lay out on graph paper the design of the Greek key, the top and the bottom showing the darker and the lighter woods here. And as you know, when you glue pieces of wood together, the orientation of the grain can be important because wood expands and contracts as it absorbs moisture. So it's important, especially if you're doing a lot of gluing, to make sure that the grain is always going in the same direction. And for segmented wood turning, the grain is always going laterally. It's going around. So you have to make sure on a piece like this that all of the grain is going in the same direction. So for example, on this piece, this horizontal, the dark piece here, the grain would be linear. Okay, this piece would be linear. This would be linear. This would be linear. But for the vertical pieces, the grain would have to be cross grain, and for the maple, cross grain. So I put together all these bowls, and I have each one labeled for dark wood or light wood and cross grain or linear grain, and cut the pieces on table saw or bandsaw and put them together. And then assembling them takes a lot of time. You just assemble, you glue two pieces at a time, wait for the glue to dry. Then you take them over to the sander, smooth off the surfaces, glue two more pieces on, let them dry, and so on as you're assembling the pieces. And then finally you end up here as 16 pieces. These are not glued yet. And then you're treating each block as a segment, so you have to miter each one. So you miter at 11.25 degrees, sanding on the miter, using the miter gauge on the sanding disc, get them all oriented together, and then you glue them together in order to make the final ring. So that took almost as much time as doing like the whole bottom half of the urn here. So, okay, I got that ring together. Now, when I first designed the thing, I didn't plan this little scalloped area up here, but if you do a lot of different work in different media, you often will run across something, you'll see something like this, and you say, well, you know, how could I do that in segmented wood turning? And the back of your mind starts working on this, and then I wake up in the middle of the night and sit up in bed and go, aha, that's how I would do it. Let me try this. So what I did to get these scallops, I simply took up a regular block like just like I would. I cut it and sandwiched a thin piece of ebony in there vertically, and then glued back on the front piece, just making a sandwich. So from the side, it would look like this. From the top, the trapezoid, it would look like this. And then in addition, I put a little piece in between each block of vertical of ebony. And then I figured, well, if I can cut it at this angle with an oscillating spindle sander, which I have. So I took an oscillating spindle sander, put in like a 2 or 3 inch oscillating spindle, and made a jig so that I could put this entire piece here at like a 15-degree angle. I did some experimenting first, and then just rested it against the spindle sander, let it go until it reached the 2 ends. And what it ended up with was this scallop appearance, because it was coming at an angle. So I got this scalloped appearance, and not perfect, but I thought it gave it a nice effect. And then after I had finished this, I thought, wow, I didn't need to do it that way. I could have done it very differently, although not on this large size. So here's another piece that I made later on, where instead of having the sandwiched ebony vertical, I turned the sandwiched ebony at 15 degrees and just put it in and did the same thing, but just turned it on. And here is a little bowl that I made with a sea urchin lid that comes off. And you can see the scallop turned out just the same as it did on here. It would have been a much shallower scallop on this diameter compared to the diameter here. So I really had to do it this way for the Greek key. Some other features. Here are some pieces that I've made. The lid is always an opportunity to make a feature. Here are some pieces that I had up here on the neck region. Here's a piece that Ron Ford did, also showing some accent embellishments. Here's another Grecian urn that I made, an urn, a cremation urn that I made years ago with the Chinese symbol shu, and some bars, handlebars, if you will, coming out that I just made by leaving unglued area back here and then inserting and gluing the pieces in afterward. Here's a platter that Ron Ford made, some pieces on here. You all were talking about the beads of courage earlier. Here's a beads of courage bowl that I made this spring that I turned. I thought I made this and put a note in there before we gave it to Hopkins, that it was specifically, most appropriately for a child of Chinese ancestry. And it has the Chinese symbol shu for longevity. And I thought, how appropriate incorporating this into a beads of courage. And there's the bead embedded into the lid. So this is another embellishment that I was able to make. And then here are some other examples, like the one that I showed, the graduate. Just putting here's the dark wood, 1/16 of an inch, 2/16, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 16, and then the maple 1/16, 2, and on the way up, just a graduated one. And then this one I tried afterward. Well, how about graduating it at an angle? Nice effect. Trust me, I will never make something like this again. It was the biggest pain in the butt I have ever tried. It turned out okay, but no way, never again. And then here's another one that I made, easy to incorporate something like this, the handles, into this Grecian urn as you're piling the segments together. Now, I have never done open segment turning. Here are two pieces that Ron Ford has done, and open segment turning is another variant of segment turning that I think has a lot of potential. I'm thinking maybe this coming year I may try a couple of open segment turnings here. Sometimes you can combine segmented turning with non-segmented. Here's a bowl that I did from a single piece of maple. I turned it, hollowed it out, did some carving around it, and then I just put this lip, this ring, which is the only segmented part, and glued that on here to kind of embellish this single piece. Here's another one. It's a beautifully figured piece of burl. I put some gold leaf here on the back. And when you look at this, you say, well, where is the segmented turning? Well, this piece of ebony right here is 16 pieces, tiny, tiny pieces, 16 pieces of ebony that are making up the lip of this piece of burl. Here's another one I did. This is a piece of sycamore, a block that I actually bought at the woodworking show in January, and turned, it was like 12 by 3 inches, and I turned it. I made it flat on the surface. I left a little ring, you can see part of it underneath. I left a ring going around, and then I put the whole thing on my table saw and cut these kerfs in here going all the way around, which cut all the way through the flat surface except for the underlying rim. And then I added, and you can see the sawed tooth underneath here. And then I added this ebony lip. It's a 16-piece ring that I glued on and then turned on the lathe. So this is another way you can just keep it simple. Just put like one little piece combining here. Okay, then finally, now these pieces I did not do. I can't take credit for this. This is Malcolm Tibbetts, who is probably the best known segmented turner in the world. Now these are some ribbons that he made, turning these half pieces here, and then turning it over, and then here, and then gluing them back together. These are actual life-sized chairs and a chess table that he made out of segments. So segmented turning is a lot like furniture making, as I started out saying. Okay, well, in conclusion, no one in their right mind does segmented turning. Okay, I accept that. But it doesn't matter. Who cares? If you want to get into segmented turning, you can get into it on a very tiny scale. Just tip your toe. Tip your toe in the segmented turning water by making little pieces like this. This was, again, Malcolm Tibbetts who made these tiny pieces. Or if you really want to get into it big time, you can turn a bowl like this one. There's Malcolm inside, sanding the inside of this bowl that he just turned, this segmented piece. So the possibilities are really, really limitless for